Welcome to Creepy Vibes. Tonight, chat, we're staying close to home. Because sometimes the true horror isn't found deep in the woods or out on a lonely highway. Sometimes it lives right next door. These are 4 disturbing true neighbor horror stories. Real accounts of everyday people who discovered that the people living just a few feet away were hiding secrets too dark to imagine. Whispers through the walls, faces at the window, and neighbors who were never who they claimed to be. But before we dive in, here's something even stranger. Most viewers leave without subscribing, and when they do, they miss the creepiest, most chilling tales that only the brave get to hear. Don't be one of them. Hit that subscribe button now, because trust me, the things we're about to uncover, they'll keep you looking over your shoulder long after the video ends. So tell me, where are you watching from? And what time is it there? Drop it in the comments. Because tonight, the horror is closer than you think. It's living right next door. Now, close the blinds, check the locks, and let's begin. It wasn't the kind of thing that could be explained away. It wasn't a case of misinterpreting a gesture or reading too much into a passing glance. No, this was something far darker. Something that rooted itself in the marrow of the bones and lingered in the corners of the mind. That was what Jake thought as he stood by the window of the living room, peering out at the small, quiet street. His family had moved into the house only a few weeks ago, a fresh start after years of a stagnant, uneventful life. And though the neighborhood was exactly what they'd been hoping for, safe, peaceful, and quiet, there was something in the air that felt off. Something that had settled in like a faint chill that no one could quite place. It was Mr. Hollis. The elderly man lived across the street, in the weathered brick house with the overgrown ivy that clung to the walls like the fingers of something ancient. At first, Jake had only noticed him in passing, sitting in his chair by the window, staring out at nothing in particular, like a fixture of the landscape. It was harmless at first. In fact, the first time Jake caught his eye, the old man had smiled faintly, his pale, wrinkled lips stretching into a polite grin. But the second time Jake caught him staring, really staring, his stomach had twisted into a knot. There was something unsettling in the old man's gaze, something predatory, like a wolf watching its prey from the safety of the trees. Jake had brushed it off as paranoia. It had been a long day, after all. And when his wife, Laura, asked what was wrong, he'd waved it away. Nothing, he'd said, trying to push it to the back of his mind. But it wasn't just Jake who noticed. Over the next few days, as they settled into their new home, strange things started happening. At night, when Jake lay awake in bed, he heard whispers, faint, indistinct murmurs, that seemed to float down the hallway from the attic. It was the kind of sound you couldn't be sure was real, but just enough to make your skin crawl. The first time it happened, Jake had chalked it up to the house settling. The second time, he tried to ignore it. The third time, he couldn't. There was something wrong with that whispering, something that dug under his skin and made the hairs on his neck stand up. But it wasn't just the whispers. Over time, Jake began to notice small things that were out of place. He would leave for work in the morning, and when he returned, a chair would be moved, or a book would be shifted on the shelf. At first, he'd suspected that the kids, Eli and Maya, had been messing around, playing little tricks on him. But they both swore they hadn't touched anything. And then there were the noises from the attic. Scratching noises, as if something was scraping against the floorboards just above their heads. Laura had heard it too. At first she'd brushed it off, attributing it to the old house, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was up there. It was on a particularly quiet night, when the wind howled outside and the shadows in the house grew long, that the paranoia finally hit its peak. Jake had been in the kitchen, alone, staring out the window toward Mr. Hollis's house. The blinds were partially drawn, but just enough light filtered through to reveal the old man sitting by the window, his pale face illuminated by the glow of a dim lamp. His eyes, those pale, milky eyes, locked onto Jake's, and for the briefest moment, Jake felt something. Something cold, something hollow, like the space between them had shrunk into nothingness. He could feel Mr. Hollis's gaze, heavy and unblinking, pressing into him. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He turned away quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. There was something about the way the old man looked at him, like he knew everything about him, the way his life had been before this move, the kind of man he was, the things he thought he could hide. The next day, Mr. Hollis didn't show up at the window. Jake couldn't explain why, but a sinking dread settled in his chest. He spent the day looking out the window, watching, waiting. Mr. Hollis didn't appear again for several days, and the absence gnawed at him. It was as if the old man had gone somewhere, or perhaps had never really been there at all. And then one day, Jake came home from work to find the front door of Mr. Hollis's house wide open. The blinds were drawn, but there was no sign of the old man anywhere. He told Laura they should check on him, maybe offer to help, though the thought of getting close to the man, of stepping onto his property, made his skin crawl. Laura agreed, but only half-heartedly, as if something about the situation didn't sit right with her either. They approached the house cautiously, as if the very air around it held secrets. They knocked on the door. No answer. They knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. That's when Jake made the decision. He tried the doorknob, and it turned. The house inside was silent, deathly silent, and the faint scent of mildew clung to the air. It felt wrong. The walls were lined with photographs, dozens of them, perhaps more. But these weren't pictures of a family, of someone's loved ones. They were photos of them. Jake's heart stopped in his chest. There, among the old yellowed photos, were images of his family, his wife and children, sitting in their living room, standing by their car, laughing on the front lawn, moments that no one could have known about. Not even the kids had ever been outside in the front yard at that time. And then Jake found it, the final image. It was a photograph of his family, taken from inside their own house, a dark figure looming behind them. The figure's face was obscured in shadow, but Jake knew, with a sickening certainty, who it was. Mr. Hollis. But the man in the picture was not the same. His skin had a pallor to it, like something that had been dead for a long time. His eyes, those cold, milky eyes, were wide open, staring directly at the camera. Suddenly, a noise from upstairs broke the stillness. A low thud, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. It echoed through the empty house. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He turned to Laura, his voice barely a whisper. "We need to leave, now." But as they turned to leave, the attic door creaked open, and in the dim light of the hallway, they saw it. The shadow. Not Mr. Hollis, but something else. Something that had been waiting for them. As they fled the house, the door slammed shut behind them with a force that shook the ground beneath their feet. Later that evening, the police arrived, but they found nothing. No sign of Mr. Hollis, no evidence of anything strange. The house was just as it had always been, empty and abandoned. The neighbors, they said, had moved out long ago, but Jake knew the truth. Mr. Hollis had died years before they'd ever moved in. What had been left behind wasn't human at all. And as they packed their things and left the house behind, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching them from the shadows, waiting, just across the street. They should have known. Not that anyone could have predicted it. Not from the pictures, not from the glowing reviews, not from the way the realtor smiled a little too brightly when they'd made their offer on the old house. But they should have known. Tara and Greg had been looking for a fresh start. The kind that only an old house in a quiet suburb could offer. Somewhere far enough from the city to breathe, but close enough to feel connected to the world. The house was a bit of a fixer-upper, but it had charm. The kind of charm that tugged at you, making you overlook its faults, like the cracks in the ceiling and the peeling wallpaper that hung from the walls in places like decaying skin. It smelled faintly of mildew, but it was the kind of smell that seemed to promise that if they just cleaned hard enough, they could erase it. The house wasn't new, not by a long shot. It had its age, its secrets. But it was the kind of place that whispered home to the kind of people who had long been looking for somewhere to plant their roots. At first, the creaks and groans of the house were comforting to Tara. They were the noises of a house settling, she thought. A house that had witnessed so much over the years. But as the days wore on, those sounds grew more deliberate, more purposeful. It started one night, the whispers. Soft, so soft that Tara wasn't sure if she'd really heard them. At first, she chalked it up to the house's old bones creaking under the weight of the wind. But then the whispers began to sound like something more. Someone more. "Did you hear that?" Tara asked, her voice barely more than a whisper, her eyes darting to Greg as they sat on the couch. Greg, who had been lost in his thoughts, looked at her with furrowed brows. "Hear what?" "The whispers," Tara said, trying to put her finger on it. "In the wall." Greg laughed it off, but there was something tight in his chest, a creeping feeling that hadn't been there before. "You're just imagining things, hun. It's an old house. It settles. Like I said." The whispering didn't stop, though. It never stopped. It lingered, becoming clearer with each passing day. The walls, thick and ancient, began to hum with a presence, an energy that was all too real, too alive. By the third night, the murmurs were no longer unintelligible. They had become voices, soft, hushed, but insistent. And then one night, as Tara sat in bed, her eyes flicking to the corner of the room, she heard it. Her name. Tara. Her heart leapt into her throat. She froze, staring at the wall, listening. "Tara, come closer." The voice was calm, almost soothing, like a whisper in the dark. But it wasn't her imagination anymore. She wasn't the only one who heard it. "Did you hear that?" Greg asked, his voice thin with fear. "Yeah," Tara whispered back, voice trembling. "I heard it too." It was coming from the wall, the adjoining wall that connected their house to the house next door. A house that they'd never really paid much attention to before. The man who lived there, Mr. Blackwell, was an eccentric old man who kept mostly to himself. He would wave in passing, but never engaged in any real conversation. He was the kind of neighbor who didn't seem to want company. He kept to his own world, and that suited Tara and Greg just fine. Until the whispers started, and they couldn't ignore it anymore. The whispers came again, louder this time, almost insistent. They could hear words now, real words, though garbled at times. "Tara, Greg, I'm waiting." They couldn't take it anymore. The walls were alive somehow, like the house was breathing with them. Tara insisted they go over to speak with Mr. Blackwell, to ask if he had heard anything strange. But when they knocked on his door, there was no answer. They knocked again, and still no one came. A feeling of unease crawled up their spines, but they didn't leave immediately. Tara, feeling bold, tried the knob, and it turned. The door creaked open. Mr. Blackwell's house was just as old as theirs, if not older. The inside was dark, the air thick with the scent of dust and disuse. The floorboards groaned beneath their feet as they stepped inside, and the silence that enveloped them felt wrong, unnatural, like the house was holding its breath. They wandered through the rooms, calling out his name, but there was no reply, not even an echo of footsteps. That's when Tara found it, the thing that would stay with her for the rest of her life. She wandered into the room that connected the two houses, the narrow, dimly lit hallway that ran along the adjoining wall. The walls here were covered in cracks, like veins running through flesh. There, at the far end of the hallway, she noticed something strange, a faint scratching. At first, she thought it was just more of the house settling, but then she saw it, small, faint marks on the wall, as if something had been dragged along it, etching into the plaster. Tara leaned in closer, her breath catching in her throat. The scratches weren't random. They were deliberate. The wall was covered in cryptic, twisted words, written in blood. The message was clear. "I see you." She stumbled backward, gasping, her mind reeling. How could that be possible? The house had been empty for years. Mr. Blackwell had never been this sick. Never. And then she saw it. The face in the wall. A pair of pale eyes, like eyes from the other side, hollow and cold, staring at her through the cracks. They blinked. Tara's heart froze, and she let out a strangled scream. Greg rushed to her side, pulling her away, but the eyes, those eyes, followed her, tracking her every movement. The moment they stepped outside, the door slammed shut behind them with a force that rattled the windows. They both stood there, breathless, staring at the old house. They never saw Mr. Blackwell again. And when they asked the neighbors, the answers were always the same. The house had been abandoned for years. That night, as they lay in bed, the whispers returned. Louder, more frantic now. They were no longer coming from the wall. They were coming from inside the house. The walls had eyes. And now they were calling for Tara and Greg. But this time, the walls weren't just listening. They were hungry. Elena had never been the type to feel unsettled by her surroundings. She had always prided herself on being able to find the rhythm in any place, no matter how new, how unfamiliar. That was how she had ended up in Oakwood Grove, a small suburban neighborhood that had a sort of hum to it, a hum of quiet lives lived in neat homes behind white picket fences. She had moved in just a few weeks ago, seeking something simple, something that could ease the scars of the life she had left behind in the city. The house itself was nothing special, a modest two-story in need of some fresh paint. But it was hers, and it was quiet, the kind of quiet that stretched out like an empty road, promising something better, something peaceful. And for a while it was. But then she began to notice the green light. It wasn't noticeable at first. Just a dull glow, a faint flicker from across the street, almost hidden behind the curtains of the neighbor's house. The Phillips family lived there, father, mother, 2 kids. Elena didn't know them well, hadn't really made an effort to. The kind of neighborly interactions she'd had with them were all brief exchanges about the weather or the kids playing in the yard. But this light, this odd green light, became impossible to ignore. At first she told herself it was nothing, just a quirky light fixture, or maybe some sort of garden light. She tried to let it go, but night after night, it grew more persistent, more unnerving. The green hue flickered steadily from the Phillipses' house, coming from somewhere inside. It was faint at first, like the glow of a firefly caught in the glass of a window. But as the nights wore on, it became stronger, more pronounced. The neighbors, too, began to change. It started with Mr. Phillips. She noticed that he no longer left the house, not even to take out the trash or mow the lawn. Elena would catch glimpses of him through the window, sitting motionless in a chair, his eyes unfocused, staring at something Elena couldn't see. His wife, Linda, wasn't any better. She would stand at the window, staring out at the street, her expression vacant, her eyes glassy and unblinking. Hours would pass like that. Elena would catch sight of her as she walked by, a shadow standing still in the window, as if frozen in time. The children, once playful and energetic, had stopped playing outside altogether. There were no more sounds of laughter, no more games or shouts. The front yard, which had once been full of life, now looked abandoned. Overgrown grass swayed in the breeze, as if the whole house had been forgotten. Elena tried to ignore it, but the nagging feeling wouldn't leave. Something was wrong. Something was off. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Elena found herself staring across the street, drawn to the faint green glow. It pulsed in a way that made her skin prickle, like it was alive and watching. She stood in her living room, her face pressed to the window, the silence of the street stretching around her. Her gaze flicked between the Phillips house and the street, her curiosity gnawing at her. Then she saw him. Mr. Phillips was standing in the front yard now, his posture strange, his movements stiff. His eyes were locked on the house, staring at the roof. He took slow, deliberate steps toward the back of the house, where the flickering green light was the brightest. Her heart began to race as she watched him climb the rickety ladder leading to the roof of the house. And there, on top of the roof, she saw it, the source of the light. A large rusted satellite dish sat crookedly on the roof, its surface covered in grime and corrosion. The dish was connected to something, a tangle of wires that snaked down into the house. The green light wasn't coming from inside, as she had first thought. It was coming from that old, dilapidated satellite dish. Mr. Phillips stood before it now, his hands trembling as he reached out. There was something unnatural about the way he approached it, something reverent, as if the dish itself held power over him. His fingers brushed the rusted surface, and for a moment, Elena swore she saw the light pulse, flicker, like it was feeding on him. Her breath caught in her throat, and she instinctively stepped back from the window, her pulse quickening. She couldn't look away. She shouldn't be looking, and yet she did. Her hands trembled as she grabbed her coat and slipped out of the house, drawn to the strange sight across the street. Her curiosity overwhelmed any rational thought. She told herself that she had to see what was going on, that she had to understand. Elena crossed the street and moved quietly toward the Phillips house. The green light bathed the yard in an eerie glow, casting long shadows on the grass. She could hear Mr. Phillips muttering to himself now, his words indistinct, like a chant in a language she couldn't recognize. She reached the back gate, pressing her ear against the cold metal. That's when she heard it. A voice. Not Mr. Phillips's. Something deeper, more resonant. It was like the voice was coming from the earth itself, from the house. The voice seemed to be calling to her, beckoning her closer, but she couldn't make out the words. Suddenly the air felt thick, heavy. A pressure built in her chest, as if the world itself was pushing in on her. She could feel her heartbeat pounding in her ears, louder than the whispers, louder than the green glow. She felt wrong, like something inside her had shifted, had been changed. Without thinking, she stepped forward, closer to the house, closer to the satellite dish, and that was when he saw her. Mr. Phillips turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto her. But they weren't his eyes anymore. His pupils were dilated, his gaze vacant, as though something was pulling at him, controlling him, using him. He grinned, but it wasn't a smile. It was a rictus, a grotesque contortion of his face. His lips stretched too far, showing teeth too white, too sharp. "Elena," he murmured, his voice a low, guttural sound that was barely human. "Join us." The voice in the ground and the air was louder now. The house seemed to shudder, to breathe. Elena stepped back, her instincts screaming at her to run, but her feet were rooted in place. The pressure was suffocating. The green light had grown brighter, more intense. Then she saw it, them. Linda, standing in the doorway, her eyes wide, empty. The children behind her, standing perfectly still, their faces pale and frozen, their mouths slack. They were all looking at her, waiting. But it wasn't them anymore. They were something else, something that wasn't human. The light flickered again, and the ground beneath Elena's feet shifted, as if the earth itself had come alive, pulling her into the darkness. And in that moment she understood. The green light was not just light. It was a call, a summons. And now that it had found her, it would never let her go. Miranda always trusted her instincts. That quiet voice in the back of her mind that whispered warnings or urged her to take action. She was the type of person who could walk into a room and feel the weight of its history, whether it was the warmth of a happy memory or the cold, suffocating atmosphere of something wrong. And when she and Sam moved into their new house on Cedar Lane, she felt confident that her intuition would guide her well. For the first few weeks, everything seemed perfect. The house was old, but in that charming, rustic way that made you feel like you were stepping into a memory rather than a home. The neighborhood was peaceful, the kind of place where people smiled when they waved, where the sound of children playing in the street wasn't just common, but expected. It was quiet. Too quiet, perhaps. And then there was the yard sale. It started small, just a few items displayed on folding tables, dusty old books, tarnished silver spoons, a worn-out rug with patterns she couldn't quite make out. The kind of things you'd expect from a typical suburban yard sale. But every weekend, the items seemed to change, and yet at the same time, they didn't. The family across the street, strangers at first, were always the ones running it, the Thompsons. There was something off about them. Miranda didn't know what it was. Maybe it was the way Mr. Thompson's eyes lingered on her just a little too long. Maybe it was Mrs. Thompson's hollow smile, the one that didn't quite reach her eyes. Or maybe it was their daughter, Claire, who never seemed to speak, just stood quietly by the table, watching everyone with an intensity that made Miranda's skin prickle. At first, Miranda thought she was being paranoid. After all, who would suspect a harmless yard sale? People got rid of old things all the time, and the Thompsons didn't seem to be any different. But over time, a sense of unease began to settle in her chest, like a cold breath on the back of her neck. Something was wrong. She wasn't sure when it started, but eventually, Miranda began noticing patterns. Every weekend, without fail, the same items appeared. Old family photos, yellowed with age. The faces blurred and faded as though the memories they captured were dissolving. There were faded documents, pages torn from some long-forgotten ledger. The strangest thing, though, was the wooden box, always placed in the same spot on the table, as though it was meant to be found. It was a box made of dark wood, with intricate carvings along the edges. Nothing too spectacular at first glance, but the way it seemed to call to her was unsettling. Sam didn't see it at first. He didn't notice the strange repetition of the objects, the subtle oddities. He just thought it was a quirky part of their new neighborhood. But Miranda, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was being hidden. Something was wrong. She began buying things. Little trinkets at first, an old lamp, a chipped teacup, a dusty book that smelled like it had been closed for too long. But the more she bought, the more she started to feel off. It was subtle at first. She'd wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, with the feeling that something, or someone, was watching her. The nightmares began. In the dream, she found herself walking through a house, one that felt familiar and yet alien, a place she had never been but knew intimately. The walls were lined with old family photos, faces staring out at her with eyes that seemed to follow her every step. There was a room at the end of the hall, always locked. But every time she reached it, the door would open, just a crack, and she would see them, people who had been there, living their lives, and then vanished. Gone. Just gone. The nightmares grew worse, more vivid. The people in the photographs were becoming clearer, their faces now impossibly real. She began hearing whispers, soft voices that seemed to echo in her mind long after she awoke. One Saturday, she couldn't resist anymore. She had to buy the wooden box. It was calling to her, almost begging her to take it. She tried to resist, tried to ignore the gnawing urge, but by the time the Thompsons' sale began that morning, she found herself crossing the street, unable to stop herself. Looking for something special today? Mrs. Thompson's voice was too sweet, too smooth. It sent a chill up Miranda's spine, but she smiled, trying to seem normal, trying to hide the sense of dread creeping over her. "I'll take the box," Miranda said, pointing to the wooden container resting on the table, exactly where it had always been. Mrs. Thompson smiled, her lips barely moving. "Good choice," she murmured. "That's a very special item." The box was heavier than she expected. As soon as her fingers touched the cool surface, the room seemed to darken. She felt a cold shiver run through her, but she ignored it. She paid, though something about the transaction felt wrong. Mrs. Thompson didn't speak again as she handed her the box, and Claire's unblinking stare followed her as she walked back home. That night she opened the box. Inside were a series of letters, yellowed with age and rotting at the edges, written in a language she didn't recognize. The ink was faded, smudged, as though time had been trying to erase them. But as she read the strange symbols, something began to shift in her mind. A sudden clarity came over her, and with it, an understanding she hadn't expected. The Thompsons weren't just eccentric, they were cursed. The items they sold weren't just trinkets. They were pieces of a much older curse, passed down through generations. Each item stolen from their yard sale carried a part of the curse with it, an ancient, insidious force that slowly took root in the buyer's soul, growing stronger with each piece taken. The people who had vanished, those faces in the photographs, those whispers in her nightmares, had all been victims. Victims of the Thompsons, victims of their curse. And now Miranda was one of them. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized the horrifying truth. The Thompsons had been watching her, waiting for her to take the bait. She had thought it was just a yard sale, just innocent little knickknacks. But the curse was real, and now it was following her. The next weekend, as she crossed the street to return the box, she saw them waiting, standing by the yard sale table, their faces now impossibly still, as though they had been frozen in time. Mrs. Thompson smiled that same cold smile, and Claire's eyes followed her movements with that same haunting intensity. But this time, there was no going back. The curse was already inside her, and when they arrived on her doorstep a few days later, she knew that she would have to give them what they wanted, because no matter how hard she tried to fight it, the curse would not let her escape. They didn't leave. They couldn't leave. Not until she gave back everything they had ever lost. And by then, it was too late.